Recording now. This is the joint food ontology work group discussion, monthly discussion for Wednesday, June 30th, 2021. And we have two presentations mainly in this show and discussion. This is the last presentation for the summer, and then we'll start up in the fall. And I think we'll refocus on actually getting into modeling some of the areas that I know Foodon and others need developed, such as recipe model, ingredient model. I will send an email out about that in early September to try to identify a good monthly meeting time. By default, I'll choose this time slot. It's just a question of whether it might be 8 o'clock or 8:30 on a Wednesday. Okay, so this morning or evening, for all of you, today, we have Andrea Borghini, Associate Professor at the Department of Philosophy, University of Milan, who's here to talk about his whole group's effort in tackling the philosophy of food. And I'll let him give his slideshow and introduction to his work and his colleagues' work. We also have Babak Ravandi, Post-doctoral Research Associate, Center for Complex Network Research at Northeastern University. And he's going to present his machine learning prediction of food processing and a couple of many interesting findings there, and a complex analysis system for nutritional content in food that's been processed to various levels. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrea Borghini, and maybe I have to give you screen sharing permissions right now.
I think I have it already, if I see.
Got it. Okay. If not,
let me try.
Yes.
Can you see my presentation here?
Yes, we can.
And let me try. Well, I guess I can also leave it like this. I think it's fine. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you really for having me and us, meaning the people from Culinary Mind, here today. It's really exciting, I think, for us, even just to be part of this conversation for a few minutes. So what I'm going to do in this just 15 minutes is to say a little bit about the approach that specifically myself and two colleagues that are here with me today, also Nicola Piras and Beatrice Serini, and some other, however, the people at Culinary Mind, in addressing food issues. Okay, and I'm calling this the rethinking of food systems, some conceptual tools, but some of these conceptual tools are also more specific, not just for food systems in general, but for something more specific. So first of all, maybe something about Culinary Mind is the first network of philosophers working on food, especially from a theoretical angle, that I co-founded 3 years ago, and that is based right now at the University of Milan, where I work. And it includes scholars that are not only philosophers, although most of them are philosophers from different continents, the US, Europe, and Asia in particular, but also some from Australia. And our goal is to organize mainly conferences, publications, events, and the conversation really about food in a way that brings together scholars that often work on similar issues, but they have never, met each other, as it happened with, I guess, probably also Damian and myself some weeks ago, when we discovered we had this interest in common, but I didn't know actually about the existence of this group. So when I talk about philosophy of food, I intend a branch of philosophy that was developed since the 90s mainly, and that by and large uses a cross-disciplinary approach from political philosophy, sociology, anthropology, but also in some cases the hard sciences, it could be food chemistry or even cognition, And it doesn't address only value-laden issues, such as ethical, aesthetical, political issues, but it also looks at ways in which science and culture do interface, and specific conceptual issues, like what is a recipe we'll see today, or what is local food, what is an ingredient. Many of us, including myself, I have a background in what can be called philosophical ontology, meaning that I studied what philosophers called ontology when they developed it. Damir and I got in touch with each other because Barry Smith, the professor in Buffalo, put us in touch. And I worked in formal semantics a little bit when I was a graduate student, and then ontology and philosophy of biology. So a number of us also have that background. So the type of issues are not only animal ethics or environmental ethics, but also what you see more down here in on the right side of the screen, like conceptual rethinking or amelioration, epistemology, and ontology and metaphysics. Here are just some very basic examples of topics that have been discussed. I just put some publications of mine. There is much more out there, of course, and like a forthcoming book called The Philosophy of Recipes, with contributions from philosophers and not only to the field, but also discussion of hunger and appetite. For example, there's a special issue of the journal Topo that just came out, and discussion of notions of wild food, local food, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So here, just to introduce a little bit about how we can think about the future of food systems, also from a philosophical perspective that is theoretical. When we think about the future of food systems, we think, of course, there are a lot of problems with current food systems that are given by the impending climate change, or the process of climate change, or by the waste, how wasteful are the food systems, current food systems and food chains, their sustainability, the sufferance we inflict to animals or plants or even ecosystems, perhaps if you think they might suffer, on the way in which we produce food, justice, the workers involved, and even for the animals and the ecosystems, the respect that we might have for them, and also what it is that we know in terms of precisely even the means of representation of food systems. There are a lot of things that we are missing, and that we have to improve. And I think a lot of what this group, if I understand, is doing is precisely to try to improve the ways in which we represent food systems, to integrate better with the other problems, to address also the other problems. We have a number of values that drive our attempts to address these problems. Values such as we want to maybe preserve biodiversity or cultural diversity, or advance the health of individuals or collectivities, specific communities, give pleasure to people, allow them to choose what they want to eat in a way that enhances also pleasures in complex ways, right? We want to be more transparent, or to be more inclusive, right? But how can we do this? And so historically, in the sense of recent contemporary history, Warren Velasco famously said that we could have two different ways of fixing food systems, in a sense. One fix that is anthropological. We could think of focusing on consumption. Like we could suggest people to consume, for example, different items. So stop eating meat and eat, I don't know, crickets, right? Insects, right? So that could be a solution. So we have to revise our own diets, right? So it starts from looking at human cultures and diets and cultures of consumption. Or we could think of fixing maybe production, right? So we could continue to eat burgers and steaks. We have just to produce them differently, like in a lab, instead of by having animal farms, right? So these fixes and the dualism between these fixes, however, has been revealed itself to be a bit problematic, because of course when you're trying to fix, say, production by having lab meat, you also encounter maybe resistance in consumers, right? So you also produce an anthropological effect, so to speak, right? So you're going to affect consumption as well. So what clearly has emerged, I think, in recent years more and more, is that the food systems have to be approached more holistically, where intervening even on a part of the production line might really affect also the ways in which we represent the food. I think some of the work that maybe some of you are thinking of doing or doing right now currently, if to fix the production might also mean to communicate differently, maybe through a QR code, through relaying different information to consumers. And that affects also, the ways in which consumers precisely approach the same issue, right? So if you have the orange from Sicily, right, but we changed the food chain by communicating differently to the producers how it was delivered to the market, we are affecting both the technology of production as well as the moment of consumption, of purchase, and so on and so forth. So in order to, to then think a bit more deeply about how to address the problems that we have, people have suggested that we should have a systemic fix, not anthropological, not technological, but a systemic. We look at the entire food system and we try to fix it. And as philosophers, especially theoretical philosophers, the way in which we see our role, what we are trying to do is to develop tools that can be implemented at different levels of the food system to rethink it, okay? So these conceptual tools, again, will be holistic, because say if you are rethinking, I don't know, what is a blood orange, how we define it, what is its identity, conditions, these will be implemented at different level of the food chain. So maybe in the software, right, that you are using to track its identity, but also in the way in which a journalist or a social media will talk about it, right? So the same concept has to be implemented at different levels of the chain, and it can be used, however, at different scales and in different points, as I was saying, of the food chain. So maybe precisely you have to find a way to encode it into a program, a computer software, so that you can ensure that that software is lined up with, or better, with what social media are doing, or what maybe a certain person in the market is talking about the food. And specifically, the type of action that we're trying to do is to engage with people who work in other fields, like anthropologists, microbiologists, sociologists, political scientists, and so on and so forth, to precisely improve the concepts that we have right now, that we use, across different levels of our food systems. Right? And in order to do this, then in order to implement these new concepts, then you can use different tools, right? So one of the tools could be formal ontology. So we can come up with a different notion, we will see it in a second, of say a recipe, or what is local food. And then we have to translate this concept into something that can be precisely encoded into a formal ontology, maybe program, or that can be designed by the use of participatory tools. So political scientists more recently used especially participatory tools to decide about the identity of certain items, or how to go about solving certain problems. And this is what we could do. So to just mention some example, think of the idea of commensality. So today we have a new notion, right, that has emerged, is the one of digital commensality. Right? So what does it mean to eat together with someone? And today we do face a dilemma about how to think of eating together. What does it mean to eat together? And we can think of forms of eating together. We could really think of having a more formally defined concept of eating together that takes into account contextual features, what kind of settings have to be in place so that you are actually eating together with someone. And the same concept that we can formalize, however, should be the one that we also use to maybe discuss eating together in a newspaper article or in some other settings, in dietary advice given by a doctor, when the doctor tells you, oh, you should eat more together with others because that will lead you to consume food with more attention or consume less or eat more slowly, things like that. But what does it mean to eat together, right? Or think of the idea of local food. So the idea of locality is really entangled with the complex notion of identity, right? So local can be an ingredient, but it can also be a recipe. There are some recipes that are considered as local to Switzerland. For example, chocolate is local, but none of the ingredients are local in that chocolate, maybe, except perhaps for milk in some cases. And so the idea of locality can be ascribed to an ingredient, a recipe, a meal, a diet, and can be used in multiple forms to claim or not that someone is eating local. So suppose you have dietary advices where you suggest people to eat local, and depending on how you are actually implementing this concept, even in a software, you might be developing a concept that is non-inclusive, is arguably non-inclusive, or is not complex enough to take into account the ways in which a target population wants to use it. So if you take, I don't know, Latin Americans living in the United States or Canada, the ways in which they might want to use the concept of locality is quite different from the ways in which other people, other segments of the population might want to use it, especially if you're thinking about white Americans, and even more generally. And this, if you have as a guideline to suggest to people to eat local in that context, and if the way in which you formalize the context cuts out the usage of the concept of Latin Americans, you're actually developing a bad conceptual tool. So what I'm saying is that we can take each of these concepts and think of how the philosophical cultural study of food can be used to rethink these ideas. I think philosophers are especially naturally positioned to do this job, especially philosophers that were trained in analytic ontology and philosophy of science, because the way in which they think is more prescriptive rather than just descriptive, right? So while typically maybe a sociologist or an anthropologist doesn't want to prescribe how to use a concept, philosophers are particularly interested in thinking of how to engineer a concept, how to think of a concept so that it can perform a certain function in a context, right? And this is more a prescriptive role rather than, so it's for policy or legal issues, and so in that sense, there is more overlap in the fact that, I know that when you have to encode, for example, come up with a certain formal representation, you're forcing a description to some extent, right? You're taking maybe a very complex, vague, ambiguous domain of discourse, and you have to regiment it in a specific way. And that's really complicated to do. And you're doing a lot of injustice, so to speak, even just conceptual injustice, because you have to leave out a lot of details. And philosophers are really interested in that because that's what they try to do in many contexts. And they like to almost prescribe this, even too much, perhaps prescribe this concept. But it's something that I think they share with also people that probably are invested in some of the enterprises. I imagine this group is invested in, if I understood. So, I mean, I will stop here because I know that we have much more to do. And today we're just guests, but this is just to give you a little of an idea of how we work. And here I put just the website, Culinary Mind of the network, and then my personal page. Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Andrea. I want to graft your brain into my brain. And the world of food-related vocabulary seems endless from the perspective of one health and total integration with what so much of our society does. I'll just say one little thing, which is, yes, I've discovered it's very delicate business being in the ontology business because of that prescriptive element. As soon as we define a term as to be used in such and such a way, as we're trying to be so precise with in food and many other ontologies, we are at the same time possibly committing a criminal act by denying other people the way they use those words. So I really appreciate the methodical approach that you're talking about. That's not just about ethics, but capturing use. So with that said, I am starting to see questions come in. And so Magali, I just want to know, is that a current question? Would you like to pose that one or more that you left in the sidebar? And if you are speaking, your microphone is off.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, fine. Thank you for the presentation. So I am French, so my English is not so good, but we'll try to express. I think you are meaning that we have to add a viewpoint to a given concept, depending of the context. And also, how do you, if it is correct, how do you add this different meaning with your participatory tools, or how do you define some? Are you making different definitions, or how do you do that?
That's an excellent question, Maggie, and it was, of course, very clear. I'll give you two examples, and I don't know if this will help a little bit, because I wouldn't speak only of context. So in some cases, you can think of it in terms of context. So with respect to the idea of eating local, you could fancy that what you mean by eating local within your home, within the boundaries of your home when you cook at home, might take on different meaning than when you speak about eating local, say in a restaurant or in a public setting, in even within France, right? So, and this is because some of us in their home, they have local identity, they have identities that are different. So maybe at home you speak a different language. You have certain customs, ways of eating, even that are different from what you do outside. You might eat at different hours and so on and so forth, right? So imagine a Vietnamese family living in Paris that at home has a certain type of table setting, eats a certain hour, share the food in a certain way, and outside engages in quite different practices, because maybe for work reasons, maybe for because you take on a different identity role, you identify yourself differently. It's I think perfectly in keeping that you might have different conceptions of locality as you switch context. But instead, if you take the idea of, say, recipe, I think that is not so much the context, I wouldn't argue that, but it's more what, for example, I've called the authoriality. So depending on who can author the recipe, I think the recipe takes on a different meaning. So take what is called the signature recipe. A signature recipe is something that only a certain person or very few people can make. It could even be yourself, like your signature recipe, but it's the one that the way you make it, no one else does. And so the idea there is that the definition of the recipe depends on a certain kind of authoriality. Now, if instead you take a recipe that you can call an open recipe, like a pasta alla matriciana, right, or a pizza margherita, you could think that anyone can author their recipe, and it's open for anyone to use. So if you take there is this TV series called Waffle and Moshi. I don't know if you've ever seen it, for kids, Food for Kids. They make gazpacho at some point, and the very famous chef that is there says gazpacho is there for the entire world. Everyone can make it and make it their own. So the way the authoriality for gazpacho is really different. The conditions of identity are really different than the ones of a signature recipe. So, for example, in terms of recipes, I think there are categories. I don't want to go now through all the categories, but those categories depend on the type of authoriality, or that's a key element. And it's not the context, it's attached to the type of recipe. I don't know if that makes sense. So that's how I think the concepts that we're using should be fine-tuned in this sense, that we should understand the place that they hold within a certain food system or culinary system.
Okay, thank you. Fine. And do you have some tools to do that? How do you do that? To define this different authorship or
The authoriality condition?
the authoriality, sorry.
Yeah, the tools are, conceptual tools. You have to build a theory of how these things work. So it's precisely, so another concept is the one based on consortia. So some recipes, their identity depends on consortia. So it's the tool there is the one of consortia. If you take the one of open recipes, I think the criteria of identity, you'd have to look into how cultural items can get defined and redefined. That's the literature that I would look. So I don't know if that if that helps. So what we are doing is linking those concepts to other literature. There is quite extensive work in some cases on food studies about precisely these conceptions, right? And so that's what we are doing. We are matching these conceptions to some work maybe has been done in food studies or in political philosophy.
And I can see how signature recipes take what looks like more of an informatic or planned or protocol set of steps from this food science notion and moves it over into the sociological identity, ownership, cultural context, and all of those other ontological spaces. And what I could say is, in the community that I practiced in Ovo Foundry, we've really focused on the sort of scientific step-by-step this and that constituent ontologizing, but the social ontology space is slow to come. And even recent reviews have talked about how behavioral ontologies of human behavior aren't that comprehensive right now. So this is all under development from even a technical perspective. But the tools you're talking about are ones we would be studying as approaches to tackling the problem rather than pieces of software. Is that right?
Oh, you're asking that to me? Or
that last bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know how much of that should be encoded into a software and how much instead should be left outside. I think it depends on the type. With recipes, maybe this thing of authoriality can be left outside in some cases, but when you think of, you will have to have some sort of operator about the different type of possibilities of changing the recipe or modifying the recipe. I imagine you have to have some ways of representing that. And I think that's where the authoriality comes in, because your space of possibility and possible modifications will have to be more reduced. So if you take something like pizza margherita, it has really a very large space of possible modifications that are in keeping with its identity. And instead, that's not the case with some, with signature recipes or precisely with maybe with the recipes of a consortium, of an item whose identity is fixed by consortium. You have a more limited amount of space of possibility.
Okay, so I see there are two other questions we could take on. One, Yusashi, if you're there, or I can just ask it.
Yeah, so thank you, Andrea. Yes, the recipe indeed, it is quite complex, and as you rightly pointed out, bringing a culture and behavior and understanding their influence on food and recipe, and again formalizing them is yet another level of challenge. And I remember you mentioned about signature recipes, and there are different categories. So do you have any reference point of those categories that you mentioned?
Yeah, I'm sending it
Okay.
right now in the chat.
Okay, excellent.
It's
Thank you
just
very
a
much.
paper.
Oh,
It's a
right.
paper
And
that was published about a year ago.
I should mention that Andrea is presenting at the Integrated Food Ontology Workshop this fall in Bolzano and September, a paper on the subject. And so it'd be great to meet everybody there. The paper title is From Philosophy to Ontology, Rethinking Food Concepts.
There will be more details, and probably Beatrice, that is now in the audience, Beatrice Serini will be there delivering the paper. I hope I can, I'm not sure yet if I will be able to come. Let's see, because I might be in the US by then.
Okay, right. And
no, but certainly we will be present because and Beatrice should be there.
Right. Okay, so one last one from Francesco, if you're there. I realize this is sort of along the same tool method direction.
Yeah, maybe it's the discussion about recipes was very interesting. I am more on another side. You were talking about, let's say, giving definition of concept and so inevitably setting boundaries, let's say, that would leave something outside the concept we are defining. So my question is, when we do this, how can we are there tools, or how can we build the consensus over the description and definition, and maybe how big this consensus should be? I mean, if a group of 5 people give a description, a definition of a class, is this enough or this is not enough? How can we decide where to stop, and how can we twist this process?
Yeah, no, this is a really important. So one way in which I see it, and then all of you can correct me on this, is so you're trying to develop formal representations of food items, and these food items, they get used by a lot of different people, and they affect, in a sense, also the lives of a lot of different people, right? And it's interesting to think of what kind of intuitions drive, right, the type of work you do, you know? And so I don't know to what extent, as you're doing this, you include, like you actually poll the people, and which kind of people you are polling, to ensure that the categories that you're using are fair and inclusive, for example, to them. Right? So the example I made before of locality and the Latin person living in the US is because if you have the wrong, so to speak, conception of locality into your software, there is a problem there, because it's if a certain food item is identified as local, but then a number of others, you know, are excluded, then you are implicitly excluding people, right, from these. And so today, a number of political scientists, and not only, but they developed, there is a relatively large literature on participatory, basically, instruments, right, for including people's opinion into certain theoretical concepts. So sometimes this is based, most examples are based on geographical locations. So, you know, people who live in a certain city or who lived in a certain region. So you poll people who live in Vancouver and you ask them, how do you use this, is this local food or not for you? And based on that, you develop your, your tool, your software, your formal representation. But of course, in some cases, this doesn't work. And I think because you are not thinking geographically, but you're thinking more in terms of, in terms that are more abstract than that. I think what is important then is to think of what are the different categories of end users of your tool. So you are developing a formal representation. Who is going to affect this? What are the different categories? And can you include different representatives from these categories when you poll them to see whether your tool has been inclusive or not, or if it has been fair or not with respect to their ideas? So there are different ways of doing this. If you have really a lot of people, you can just poll them, meaning like you offer them some money and to give you a response, you know, $5, and if they respond to a certain questionnaire. Often in the geographical settings, you know, in a city, what they do is also they host what are called like mini publics, for example. So you actually host a debate, public debate, and you ask to these people questions. You have them debate about your most controversial issues, and you see what they say. You know, so you have the representatives of different, you know, positions or different communities, and you see what kind of responses they give you. And based on that, then you build a more intelligent, meaning like a formal representation that is more inclusive of their opinion. So that you know at that point, or you have a bit more you know, hope that you are including actually, that you haven't left out really important aspects of your representation. The risk of representing tools like, I don't know, what is a pizza margherita, just to say something simple. I don't know the level of description you have, but what is fish? What is a pizza margherita? What is meat? Without polling people, is that precisely you might be coming up with categories that are really not what people are using. And then you risk of developing a tool that is actually not very useful, or that is particularly detrimental to some communities. And one thing that I imagine you also have is that in this group, I don't know the diversity of this group, you know, of people that are formalizing, but clearly if we're trying to come up with a formalization, we have to think of what could be our guiding intuitions. One of the questions that Magali asked me before, I understand the importance of that, like what are the methods that you use? Because it's true that if I just use my intuitions, I have all sorts of biases, right? It can't be, so I have to rely on other people, on people's literature studies on these topics. I don't know if this helps to answer, but so basically you can look at different participatory tools, depending. If you give me a specific case study, I'll tell you how proceed, but either you involve people and you have a conversation with them for about like 2 hours, you know, 2 or 3 times discussing some problems, or you can simply poll them with Q&A that are, you know, open or not with respect to the answers. But I would certainly include that because the variability of conceptions about food. And also if you think of kids, some of the tools that you develop really go also to affect kids in schools, or a really important person in this respect, I don't know if you've ever, you know, is this Jeremy. I don't know if Magali, you know Jeremy, works at the Bocuse Institute.
I don't know.
He's doing a lot of work on cognitive you know, responses, especially of kids to food presentations and representations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'm interested in all of that too. Moving into the marketing side of things, even of food. We have time to slip one more question in, Julia.
Well, hi to everyone. Thank you, Damien, for having me today. So I'm Giulia Menichetti, and thank you, Andrea, for your talk. My question is actually related to the last couple of concepts that you just touched. So I'm trying to translate everything you presented from a public health perspective. Okay, that means somehow, and sorry if I'm going to simplify here, have patience. So let's say that we're going to come up with, let's say, a list of labels, adjectives for foods, right? A QR code or whatever, but basically a representation of food, right? Then there is the translation part. There is the connection to the public, right? So we want to empower the public. We want to give the consumer the possibility to choose, right? Or to even provide representation of whatever they are cooking in their own home. But have you ever thought about how to educate the public about on this complexity? Because somehow it's like a feedback loop, right? So some of the labels you can come up with won't be that popular, or will be at a level of complexity that will never be really used, right? On the other side, you have also to somehow engage the public into learning this new language, right? Because otherwise you will fall into the usual, let's say, the most common ways to think about food, right? So have you thought, I guess the answer is yes, about the educational part of this problem?
Yes, but when I thought about it, one thing I realized is precisely that we were missing the analysis of the concept. So what I was talking about recipes before, I think that 5-6 years ago, I wrote a paper that's called precisely What is a Recipe? And it wasn't the first paper because I had written another one just a little bit before, but there was no theoretical account of what is a recipe. So you're trying to come up with a formal representation of a recipe. You use it in maybe in systems, in informatics system all the times, but there is no legal discussion, philosophical discussion about what constitutes the identity of a recipe. How do you fix it, right? So what I saw is that if we don't even develop the tool conceptually, then we cannot even communicate it, right? So one of the things I saw missing was that. So think, then you have that, and then you start thinking, so about recipes, educate people to think, who can author this? And that could be a question, for instance, or locality. What's your, how do you construct your locality at home? Or waste, there could be questions you can ask about waste, right? So we can, I think then we can develop typical questions that we can train people to ask themselves. We can, but I don't know if this maybe answers.
Would that, so just always to brainstorm a little bit, would this work comparable to, I don't know, Amazon Turk do whenever they're labeling images? Would that be useful for you if you come up with, a system of labels that are possible to be used, so basically you have your dictionary somehow, and then people can come up with somehow their own personal understanding and then tag images, and then you can go through the statistics and understand really what is the language that these people currently use. So that would give you a picture of what is the current state of the understanding of of the language of food for general population. But on the other side, then you can also say, okay, let me give you some sort of education about the different shades and the different scale of information that you can put on food, and then let's see if your tags change at all. Is it something that?
Yeah. Let me see if I can grasp your worry here, because if it's that, I can see a really important thing. So one worry one might have is that I'm just asking to use concepts, thinking, and that's really hard to do for people. No, because it's true, I'm going into so many fine-grained details. And one thing I see here, so I'll tell you just this brief story. So the main course I teach for undergrads in Milan is called Semiotics of Food. And one the key point of that course is about the fact that most of the communication about food is not verbal. I mean, that's really important too, but it's not verbal, right? It includes perceptual cues and then all sorts of cultural, symbolic functions that are attached to them. And the example you just gave me, the one that is used by Amazon, is precisely perceptual. And you can think not just the tag. I think we might have been thinking of this even simplistically. Shape, I don't know, the shape of the box, or just things like that. They might suggest even implicitly to a consumer how to approach it, how to look at it. Think how much communication happens when you see a food sometimes between the shape he has, how he presents to you visually, and the way you're supposed to consume it. Some food, from the moment you look at them, even if you never had them, you know how to eat them. And that's because there is a lot of information that is contained. Jeremy is precisely a person that I've had a lot of conversation with him, this Jeremy Lafrère, that understands this type of, so developing tools along that line can be interesting, right? So some of the information could be encoded, so to speak, not on the name of the label, not on the concept, but on the shape, on the color. Like we have used all sorts of, but we can think of more tools precisely because today we have developed so much more understanding of perception.
I'm just pointing to the problem that I think you have to deal with. That is, there is a chance of overwhelming complexity, right? And the consumer is, I tend to think that whenever you want to empower people to make decisions, at the end you start with a space that is extremely large, thinking about all the possibilities, and then you go down to very simple, actionable things. So I want to see how you will, develop and think about this problem. Sorry,
that's a great challenge. No, of course, I think you're right. I don't have an answer. The simple thing, I don't have an answer right now. I think we should work on that.
Okay, I really appreciate this discussion. I'll just say we are in this group, in particular the Food On, we are actually getting into consumer marketing, looking at what people are buying in databases of food involving millions of purchases and consumer behavior as a possible project for 2 years starting in January. So we will be talking about this a lot more and benefiting from your knowledge there. And we can probably also shift a bit of this discussion over to Culinary Mind. Andrea, I've been there on your site and looked at a number of videos, and it's just amazing content, wonderful, wonderful content you've got going there. Okay, so I would like to shift and ask, I guess, first of all, Babak, do you have a half hour now to present? I think that's about what you needed for presentation, and then
yes, sure.
Okay, and then free time for discussion after that. Okay, so this is a shift. This is a shift over from the philosophical, wide-ranging, over to quite an informatic analysis. And Babak hasn't been working in ontology, but one of the questions I want people to think about behind the scenes is how would we describe your work using ontology, and which areas are needed to develop further to really capture what you're doing. So over to you, Babak.
Sure, thanks, Damian. Thanks a lot for having me. And I have to say, it's amazing to see food is connecting all the disciplines from philosophy to physics. Well, I am a technology expert, and my goal is to create technologies to nudge individuals to make healthier, better choices. And this project is very much aligned with that. So let's dive in. So first question, what is ultra-processed food? Short answer, it's an experiment that went wrong. And why? Because if you just Google, it doesn't take much time to see ultra-processed food consumption is linked with cancer. It's linked with mortality. It's linked with depression and many other problems. And well, in the nutshell, we can say it's made from ingredients that are not found in households. And the term ultra-processed food is coined by the NOVA classification, which undoubtedly is a great contribution to public health and science. So what is NOVA classification? It's a categorical system that breaks the food supply into 4 categories. So the first category is minimally processed food, and then it goes all the way to ultra-processed food. I borrowed this picture from SIGA, which is another group of scientists that are also working on alternative approaches to NOVA classification. And we can see just from this picture that a very high percentage of the food supply is considered ultra-processed food. So what would be the reason to go beyond NOVA classification? I listed 4 reasons. One would be unfair equality, because NOVA classifies over 70% of the US food supply equally ultra-processed. And that could have some consequences, especially in terms of decision-making for policies. Another issue is NOVA requires detailed recipe information, which is not available in many databases other than highly quality databases like USDA NHANES and FNDDS. And it relies on manual classification. In the literature, it is a common practice to have multiple experts to classify foods to ensure a proper classification. And also absence of nutrition facts in decision making. It's only based on the ingredients list. So we proposed FoodProX, which is a way to go from a categorical classification to a continuous score. In essence, it's a random forest classifier that is trained based on NOVA classification. So you can think of, we have FoodProX as a box. If we give nutrition facts of a food item, it will give you 4 probabilities of each of the 4 classes of NOVA. And the sum of the probabilities is, of course, 1. And with that, we can have a prediction which NOVA class it is. But then the issue is, how can we go from categorical to a continuous score? And in order to do that, we went ahead and create a phase space of the 4 classes of these probabilities, which is basically a dimension reduction, a very known technique, principal component analysis, reducing 4 dimensions to 2. And we can see that it forms a triangle in 2 dimensions, of course, because there are 3 dominant classes in the NOVA. And in this picture, we are basically showing, first of all, the items that NOVA has already classified on the database, which is 34% of the food items in the FNDDS 2009-2010 database. It's filtered only the items that has a NOVA label. And we can see that even in those items, when we use our classifier, what happens is there are a lot of food in these areas, the peripheral areas, that it cannot completely make up its mind in which NOVA class it belongs. So there is ambiguity there. And that's actually one of the reasons we need a continuous variable. And the nutrient panel that we use in this particular database, FNDDS 2009 and 10, is 99 nutrients. It's from regular macro and macronutrients all the way to flavonoids. So before getting too much into nitty-gritty here, so let's just take a look at the full picture. 100% of the database classified, and we can see all those foods that are missing, actually they're filling this space. And so the processing score, we defined it as the orthogonal projection of basically food item with this line. And that's just the formula that we use in order to define a processing score. And if we sort all the foods according to their processing score, we get this nice line that you can see that, for example, for onion from raw, it's getting a very low score, and all the way up to boiled and fried onion, and all the way up to the onion rings frozen. It has a very large amount of variability in capturing different types of processing applied on this food, on this model data set, which is FNDDS 2009 and 10. And looking into the categories, what we eat in America, which is the categories that USDA provides, we can see that our processing score is capturing a very large amount of variability in these types of foods, which is exactly what is needed in order to make a public policy and application of food processing in order to make decisions and move forward. So for example, here you can see 4 different cereals that they have processing a score of 0.56 all the way up to 0.99 from the same brand. So now that we have this theoretical tool and this classifier to basically assign a number between 0 and 1 to each food item, can we also extend it to individuals in order to assign a diet processing or a score for each individual? And the answer is yes. We have done that in a database of NHANES from 1999 to 2006 for 20,000 people, individuals, adults. And this is basically a weighted caloric version of the diet processing index. And that's the distribution that we got over the population. And we also have done another version of it that is weighted based on the grams. And so moving forward, the first application of this project is, well, can we have an environmental wide association study in order to see what associations we get with processing a score that we develop and all different class of variables provided in NHANES. So NHANES provides thousands of variables. Every 2 years, they go and randomly select people in the United States and draw tests, urinary tests, blood tests, and in order to basically see what health, what conditions are in people in a population in terms of health and in terms of exposure to chemicals from acrylamides all the way to pesticides, heavy metals, and etc. So we have this huge panel of variables, and we went ahead and we decided to only work on the variables that were present in at least 2 cycles of NHANES. And the sum of the variables that have this criteria is 405 within NHANES 1999 to 2006. And this is thanks to another work called Exposome by Patel et al. From Harvard that harmonized all these 4 cycles of NHANES into one nice database. And then the way we have done this environmental wide association study is we are basically changing the y side of the equation. It's a linear regression that the left side is actually changing because there are different exposures. And then after correcting for sample size and other stuff, we have 209 unique associations that we found with these variables versus 92 that is observed with manual NOVA. So it's also giving a stronger, better signal compared to manual NOVA classification. Looking more deep into these associations, we found associations with metabolic syndrome and coronary heart disease. Like the more processed food is consumed, people who rely on a lot of like highly processed food, we can see deficiency in vitamins and nutrients. And other classes like with even body measure, with diseases, with like chemicals that comes from packaging and everything else. This is a schematic of the whole space of these variables, and there might be a possible connection with ontology building here as well. Because if we trace the source of contamination, it may assist us to answer some questions that are ambiguous in ontology building. I remember in the food processing ontology workshop every 2 weeks that there was a discussion, is transportation also a process? How about packaging and all that? And using a data-driven approach from this, recovering from people's blood that, hey, there exists furans. Furans is a process of packaging or canning the food. Or there are other related pollutants that are coming from just transportation, the exhaust, or the big cargo ships. So that could also help to build more comprehensive ontology in terms of food processing. And the second application is food substitution that we worked on this paper. So now that we have this processing score, we can go ahead and do some substitution. What if people, instead of taking a highly processed food, let's say instead of having pizza, they start cooking at home, and we just replace one single food item? What would happen in terms of all these metabolic syndrome, in terms of what that implies? Would the population have like decreased amount of metabolic syndrome and deficiency in vitamins or not? And we observed that just by having an isocaloric replacement, meaning that we keep the caloric amount same, and just by one single food item, a decrease in the odds of metabolic syndrome by 12%, which it is very helpful in order to basically create tools and policies in order to better regulate the consumption of food processing. I actually heard on BBC that recently they are banning the advertisement of highly ultra processed food during daytime, both on internet and TV. So we can see that there are big changes are happening in terms of policy making. And finally, this is our team, and this work is a part of our lab's broader vision to fix the food system, the Food On project. The leader of this project is Julia, that are also available in this talk. And Julia and I are open to discussion on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Babak and Julia. I can now see some clear grappling hooks that we could attach between our process ontology and the particular contextual modeling of transportation, for example, or any of those other things. So that's great, because now I can see that we could link straight to particular chemicals that show up in those processes. And of course, each one of those sounds like a research project. But
exactly. Each of the association is like a paper could be done.
Right.
But, yeah, we can definitely do that if we can find time and enough resources to basically find in the literature what is the source of this contamination and all that, and then that could be helpful in building a very practical ontology.
Great, great. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Rhiannon just to handle some time for the questions. I have to head off to an interview to hire a programmer to help us with all the ontology work, so I'm going to do that and say goodbye, and over to Rhiannon. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming and to the presentation. So over to you, Rhiannon.
Great, yeah, hi. Yeah, if anyone has any questions and they don't want to speak it out loud, feel free to type it in the chat and I can relay it for the recording.
Hello, this is Nanda McGinty. This is very interesting, this paper and this presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you think some of your findings can help create better definitions for all the concepts and all the processes that you talked about.
Julia, do you want to take that question?
Today the talk is yours, so if you want to start, then I'm always happy to.
No, please. I think you because you're handling all.
So I think that well, first of all, it would be very useful, and maybe we can have a follow-up of this discussion in another session. It would be very useful that you guys take a look to the exposures, the chemical exposures that were found associated with the processing score that are signature for possibly some of the, let's say, labels that you like, some of the concept that you're currently mapping in your ontologies. To me, as a physicist, then there is also another type of question that I'm very interested in, that is, developing metrics of comparison of ontologies, right? So in the same way as Babak showed to you, that we look into the variability of the food processing score in the categories defined by what we eat in America, right? You can come up with a comparable analysis of your groups, of your categories, or anything that you're kind of trying to put together from a hierarchical standpoint, right? So I think that it would be very interesting to look at the system you're kind of developing in this specific moment and see what is the heterogeneity of the measurements of the products that would be classified, labeled with the same set of tags. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think that you're right. It's important to have clear metrics on how we measure things. And I don't think it's very clear right now in the literature.
Well, so from a mathematical standpoint, and I'm not saying that ontologies are the same as taxonomies and hierarchical trees. I don't want to enter in that huge discussion.
You probably want to.
No, that's red flags all over. But there are, let's say, information theory tools, or also network theory tools that can look into the structure of the tree and try to compare more or less. If from a structural standpoint, you are observing, you are somehow developing a comparable knowledge system. But then what we are trying to suggest here is to say, well, what is the consistency of the foods that we're labeling the same way from a food processing standpoint, right? So the idea here would be how much heterogeneity is good, how much, like, what is the tolerance somehow, right? Because if you're putting, like, you expect to see limited heterogeneity when you are using a very high number of labels. When you are using the same number of labels, but you're using different labels, do you see a different type of outcome? So the idea here would be to use this measurement as a metric to go through the different level of resolution and see how much gain in heterogeneity of the processing score you're actually capturing. So this is my interpretation.
Yeah, I know, I see your point, and I appreciate you guys trying to clarify the borders of these different labels. So thank you.
Yes, and I just sent a very good tool called Graph Hierarchy that I'm currently using in another paper, which is related to structure of syntax in languages. This can be helped a lot in order to measure and compare different hierarchies, different ontologies.
Great. I see a question from Kat. Did you want to take a moment to read it out? If not, here, I can go ahead and do it if you don't want to. So thank you for sharing your work with us. Do you have any plans for how to suggest the replacement foods? And do you need additional data about unprocessed foods that could be alternatives?
Sure. Yes, we do have some plans. Depends on the database that we are using. So for example, if you're using FNDDS, we can easily suggest what would be the replacement, what would be the next best option, because they already have their own categories of food, what we eat in America, and we can say within this same category, cereals, this is the least processed option that you can. So if you have databases that have nutritional facts in them, you can share it with us, or we can also give the code to you, and you can basically assign a food processing score and then do the substitution.
Can I add one thing,
Sure.
just to connect even more our work to your work, guys, where I see a lot of future work. So in the paper, if you read it, you will see that the whole idea of food substitution was, minimal food substitution was, okay, we don't expect people to really change their dietary habits. we expect them to go and choose at the supermarket, the grocery store, within more or less the same categories, okay? So do we trust what we eat in America is debatable. Let's say that for now we trust it, okay? So we can come up with the best option within each category according to how much you consume of it. And that's the whole optimization principle that is implemented in the paper. But clearly, this all analysis depends on the classification system, right? So it is meaningful and also definitely connected to health outcomes, right? And so to public health guidelines to come up with a meaningful classification system that then it will help us to basically rerun the calculation and give you an estimation of how to do substitution. And in the same time, this is connected to the question that I asked before, it's like, for us, the translation part is very important. So it means that we can go and try to show to you basically the spectrum of processing score in grocery stores. But on the same time, we can try to empower the consumer to, with an app, you go to grocery store and we can suggest you what is the least processed version of something within the same category that you would purchase. But of course, again, in order to talk to the consumer, you have to come up with the language of classes that are well understood by the consumer. So this is all your work, guys.
Exactly. We are contending with basically having a more meaningful and well-defined list of categories for food.
May I ask a follow-up?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So in terms of data, food composition data about unprocessed food, my experience with Food Data Central is that it's lacking a lot of unprocessed food items that maybe just aren't a big part of the US diet, or people haven't gotten around to creating food composition data that Food Data Central has integrated yet. And I'm wondering, would it be helpful to you if you had additional data sources that centered unprocessed foods so that you could supplement the range of recommendations that you offer your users?
Yes, that would be definitely very useful. We also noticed that. And one way to make it up for the lack of unprocessed food is using the standard reference database. It had very more number of very, very less processed food in it. I'm not sure if the Food Data Central portal is actually showing those food from legacy standard reference databases, but definitely yes.
Yes, so I think that everything that is under the hat of the USDA, so Food Data Central is basically collecting all the different databases, is more or less lacking, as you said, the unprocessed part. We also see from a consumption standpoint, when you look into NHANES and FNDDS, that the consumption is really not great on that part of the spectrum. Said that, you have to think about this classifier, and so then potentially everything that we are going to suggest as the more variability it sees, the merrier, right? So you want to give that, the idea is that you want to give as much variability as you can, because otherwise you will always be a little bit biased, despite all the mathematics you can put in towards the majority classes, right? So if you have sources that are alternatives, please point us to those, because it would be definitely beneficial.
Could I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Right. No, it's very interesting, your machine learning. I'm wondering how you're addressing the new introduction of a lot of the plant-based meat, dairy, protein, alternative products, which some people like the Nova folks who might consider as ultra processed, but for example, from a policy perspective, USDA just allowed the Impossible Burger folks to get a really lucrative contract to be presenting the Impossible Burger as a protein substitute for children in the school lunch program. So I'm wondering, it's like, we have this whole new wave of these alternative products. How is your system going to be addressing them?
Wow. It's a great question. I mean, that's Julia's expertise on.
Well, we have so there's actually a paragraph about this in the paper. Actually, Babak, can you pull out the phytoestrogen panel so we can kind of answer with that?
yes, that's it. Idea.
So, well,
there we go. Phytoestrogens.
Yeah. So let me. Okay, so as you can see there, we have association with our score with, these are all phytoestrogens. If I remember correctly, they're measured in blood, right? Mm-hmm. Or yes. So here you see that we have enough discrimination power to actually distinguish between two types of vegetarian diet. Mm-hmm. One is that is really based on basically unprocessed vegetable and fruit and stuff like that, and stuff that is ultra processed soy-based products, right? And of course, I mean, there is I don't want to enter into the debate about soy, also because I'm a physicist, I'm not a doctor, so I know my limitations. Frankly, I would think not twice, 3 times, 4 times before using this amid substitutes. That's my personal choice, okay? Especially if they're soy-based. So I think our line of work up to now, it's not just connected to this work, is related to what are the ranges, natural ranges of concentrations of chemical compounds in food and how we evolve to tolerate them. Hopefully we will have soon another paper about basically this. So evolution, metabolic ranges, what is the chemical makeup that we tolerate. So to me, even if it's something is plant-based but is ultra processed, I would expect this to be extremely altered and modified and to present a chemical makeup and potentially other type of additives and emulsifier. I don't have the whole recipe of Impossible Burger. I have to look into this. That would drive me not to trust really this as this new staple food.
No, I actually agree, and I haven't tasted the Impossible Burger yet for part of that reason. But I know that younger populations are much more open to these protein alternatives, and it's being used as a way to market a more environmentally friendly protein option within a food system narrative. So it really does become very complex.
I totally, so again, we fall back to a matter of language and where again, it's fundamental to educate the population to a very, very key concept here. Being environmentally friendly doesn't mean that it's healthy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so
healthy for people, because when we talk about healthy people and planet, it may be healthy for the planet, but not necessarily for human health.
Exactly. So human health and environmentally friendly are two different concepts. Right. Sometimes they overlap, and that's great. Sometimes they don't. I don't think they have any type of clinical trial, not even epidemiological study, to prove anything. They really push on the environmentally friendly label. And I respect this, but the problem is also whenever you try to play on the fact that people tend to naturally connect this with the idea that something is healthy also for humans, right? So I think there is a lot to look into.
So just to go back to your example, I want to make sure I understand it. The phytoestrogen content of the ultra-processed vegetarian diet actually produces some unintended consequences for human health that perhaps haven't been considered when offering this product to people as a viable alternative.
Yes, yes. So again, here we're just doing, so what I think it's important from the study that we have done here, it's an EWAS study, so environment-wide association study. You're just seeing the strongest association that survive. Still, we're talking about association. So you see that the processing score is, and again, so it could be a, let's say, I just like, it could be, it's not, we're not talking about anything causative. But the processing score is highly predictive of what? Of all the worst disease phenotypes and bad health phenotypes. In the same time, it's also telling you, by the way, I am correlating with this type of, I'm anti-correlating with this type of diet, and I'm correlating with this other type of diet. So we don't have causative links, but we have enough material to connect, like kind of remove the processing score and connect the two and try to investigate those in a better way.
Yes, and another question is, how realistic is it even to have a causative link? Like, is that even, you know, possible in terms of how much data we have, what experiments we can run and all that?
Yeah, so in epidemiology is it's like we have been discussing about doing causal inference for some time. It's, yeah, so in epidemiology is that's a huge challenge. But anyway, so to me, this is enough finding to put a little bit on hold all this hype on meat substitution products. So just to take a very, very careful look at it.
Thanks a lot for the question.
All right, any last questions? Don't see any raised hands.
I actually have one more last question. I'm reviewing a paper now on endocrine disruptors and obesity risk. And I had not been previously aware of the link. You know, obviously there's a lot of human health risks related to endocrine disruptors, but it goes back to, I think, your point about the packaging of the food, which I would not consider, well, processing of the food itself, but it's the packaging that might, you know, leak into, you know, chemicals into the food itself that's then consumed by people. So have you thought about endocrine disruptors as a group of chemicals that are part of this ultra processed food, you know, world that give us concern, additional concerns that we need to take into account?
Yes, of course, like phenols, phthalates, these are basically directly linked with all those issues. So we haven't gone much deeper. Julia, do you have any comments on this?
No, I think this would be okay. We would love to have that information to actually dissect. So not necessarily some of these findings are, again, related to a physical chemical modification of ultra processed food, but really a contamination, right? As you point out. So again, the whole debate about why ultra processed food makes us sick, it's like, it's currently going on, and it's very wide, and it goes from, you know, more contaminants. So not necessarily we have done something bad, but simply because it goes through this whole food supply, and like that maybe we have to revise somehow. It will definitely show more contaminants. On the other side, there is, as I mentioned before, physical and chemical modification of whole foods, right? That we are not, we didn't evolve to tolerate. And then there are additives plus emulsifiers plus whatever they're putting in that, you know, is making this more palatable. It goes very quickly through our digestive system. We feel hungry and we eat more and we consume more calories and yada, yada, yada. So there are many axes of analysis, I think it would be very interesting to start say, okay, we have information about packaging. Let's correct the analysis for this. Okay. And so that's why, again, if you have a quick way to classify the foods that people are consuming, you can always go back and, change the epidemiological analysis and try to take into account these factors and see what are the associations that survive. So I hope I answered.
Yes, exactly. Like these associations in phthalates and phenols, they are basically directly in the literature connected with the packaging. And we also recovering that with both in the blood and urinary samples from the population and with association with ultra-processed food consumption, PCBs and all that. So these are all follow-up works that can basically branch out, or the other works like you are doing basically can reference to this in order to make a stronger evidence.
Mm-hmm. If I can add one additional point here that I think it's striking, and I don't know if it came out clearly in the discussion. So you have to consider how limited is the nutrient chemical resolution that we currently we're dealing with. And the fact that, so all these chemical traces of processing or packaging or like stuff like that should come up in some sort of food models, right? That is another thing that I know you're dealing with. But so we don't have anything about that chemical resolution that we're feeding to the machine learning classifier and to our processing score. But we're able to recover basically the presence somehow, the ghosts of these chemicals in the population studies. So this is interesting because it's kind of telling you also a story about what are the type of chemicals that we should really monitor in the food composition data.
Exactly. A lot of work can branch out from this.
We hope, at least.
That's what we hope. That's why we need to stay in the dialogue. The more people talk about these issues, the better we find the lines.
Me again. I have one more question. If you could have data about one aspect of the set of foods that you have that you can add to this analysis that you think will make it much better, what would that be?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Yeah.
Just one.
That's one. Is it?
Well, you can give me as many as you want, but at least one.
Yeah.
So it's not really one, it's more a way to, so currently I'm giving to the classifier the nutrient profile, okay? I would love to give to the classifier something that is related to your work, that is related to the type of processing, right? So if I come up with an ontology about foods and the type of processing they are going through, that I have the feeling that is something that you're doing. No, I'm kidding. I know that you're doing this. And I can come up, so basically it's like adding from a mathematical standpoint, I will have my nutrient matrix, and then I have my ontology based matrix, okay? A barcode, a QR code, whatever code you wanna use. Then when you start using machine learning on this, you can come out with an explanation, a feature importance, right? Of any time you're predicting something, so our process is something, what is the real process, behind this that is driving the prediction, okay? And in the same way, then you can go and do epidemiological analysis. So to me, the next step of this would be to have still the chemical part is fundamental because it's telling us basically what are the nutrient alterations that are driving the classification and the processing score. But in the same time, you want to come up with a connection between nutrient alterations and type of processes the food went through. So this is the feature that I would add. What is the coverage currently? and how easily we can do it. Yeah. So that's my dream. That's the future. Maybe it's too much.
I hope not.
Yes, great. We can benefit by basically adding more existing data as like ingredient list and all that is manually, Nova is already manually using that. So incorporating that into making the score also would be another next step.
All right, well, thank you so much. It doesn't look like we have any questions, but thank you everyone for bringing such a fruitful discussion. This has been wonderful.
Sure.
Our pleasure. So, well.
So thanks a lot, and I'll see you everyone in 2 months, I guess, because all right, great.
Yeah, have a good day, and thank you for having me today, and good luck for all this huge collaboration, and I'm very curious to see the results because we need them.
Exactly.
Have a good day. Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.